Believe it or not, there was a time when passenger and freight trains ran directly on the streets of Manhattan, resulting in a situation so dangerous that 10th and 11th Avenue were known to most as Death Avenue. And although the city and residents alike wanted to urgently remove these tracks, they really couldn't, as the rails had become a lifeline to the city and were connected to a much greater network beyond. You see, over a century ago, this was the center point of one of the most extensive rail lines in the United States, stretching from New York City to Indiana and all the way up into Canada. Constructed by one of America's most renowned capitalists, it suffered the same fate as many of the United States' other largest industries and has since been abandoned and all but forgotten. But how did this story unfold, and what remains today? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of the lost New York Central Railroad. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Before the New York Central Railroad, there were several smaller railroads across the northeastern United States. The earliest of these was the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, incorporated on April 17, 1826, and changing its name to the Albany and Schenectady Railroad on April 19, 1847. This made it one of the first railroads ever constructed, connecting that 16-mile distance between Albany and Schenectady like never before. However, it was not initially a freight rail. When it opened, it only served pedestrian traffic, as the freight was handled by the newly opened Erie Canal, which we have previously spoken about in other videos. Anyhow, the freight that did travel on this railroad was required to pay a toll, or outright blocked, if the shipment was valuable enough. This was a common trend among the railroads that made up New York Central, as the state needed to pay for their construction. Aside from the Albany and Schenectady Railroad, the other railroads that eventually made up New York Central were Utica and Schenectady, Syracuse and Utica, Auburn and Syracuse, Buffalo and Rochester, Schenectady and Troy, Rochester, Lockport, and of course Niagara Falls. There was also Buffalo to Lockport, Mohawk and Valley, and Syracuse and Utica Direct. These constructions took place over the course of 26 years, from 1826 to 1853, and cargo tolls for freight were discontinued in December of 1851, freeing them up to ship cargo and causing profits to soar. Even before this, the companies in charge of these railroads were already discussing a potential merger. Unifying the lines offered mutual benefit for all parties involved, as trains would not be transferring from one company to another, and all the railroads could share the profits of the whole journey. And so the same year the Syracuse and Utica Direct Railroad opened, the railroads consolidated into one continuing line. And so it was. The New York Central Railroad was born on May 17th, 1853. Despite this consolidation of rail lines, the New York Central Railroad was generally stagnant for the first decade of its unification. The only exceptions were a few minor expansions, including the addition of the Rochester and Lake Ontario Railroad, the Lewiston Railroad, and the Buffalo and Niagara Falls Railroad, just to name a few. But the most significant change was not a new addition to the lines, but new management. In 1864, the New York Central Railroad became one of the first pieces comprising the railroad empire of Cornelius Vanderbilt. To those unaware, Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the most noteworthy figures in the history of American industry. He had an enormous amount of business ventures, but his most significant one, as of the mid-1860s, was in the business of water transit. To give an idea as to how important Vanderbilt was, as he was getting into steamboats, a common nickname for steamboat entrepreneurs of note was Commodore, which was the highest rank of the United States Navy at the time. He first gained this unofficial title in the 1830s, but by the 1850s, he was the one and only steamboat Commodore. No one else could compare. And in 1864, he was entering the railroad business, looking to achieve the same prestige, but in another industry. Vanderbilt had already acquired the New York and Harlem Railroad, and with the acquisition of the Hudson River Railroad, the New York Central Railroad became one of the first major corporations in the United States. It became known as the New York Central and Hudson Railroad, but later was shortened to the New York Central Railroad. This was an extremely significant development occurring at a perfect time, as New York City began an explosive period of population growth. This railroad allowed these newcomers to the city to access the rest of the state. And after some more acquisitions by Vanderbilt, particularly the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway, the New York Central connected New York City with Chicago, Detroit, and even Canada. Vanderbilt died in 1877, and expansion continued after his death, but his legacy would be grand. At its peak, the New York Central Railway featured 26,395 miles of rails. One of the biggest factors in the railroad's success was that it provided rail access to downtown Manhattan. While boats previously had fulfilled this role with the consolidation of rails that Vanderbilt had overseen, the inland reach was unmatched by anything else. The rail that filled this role was still known as the West Side Line. Initially, the endpoint of the West Side Line was a one-story train shed at St. John's Park, now known as the Tribeca neighborhood. Constructed immediately after Vanderbilt acquired it in 1866, it was intended to be a temporary location, but the following year, the Commodore constructed a state-of-the-art building at the location. The new St. John's Park Freight Depot featured tracks running directly inside the building, freight elevators and offloading cargo, and enough space in the three-story structure to facilitate 96 cars on 8 tracks. The terminal also featured some processing areas for incoming cargo. It could store general goods, hold cold products, and featured facilities for grocery stores, wholesale merchants, and other dry goods, where handlers would bring carts and pick up their shipping at any time, day or night. It was more than just a practical feat, though. The freight depot also featured a bronze statue of Vanderbilt and a pediment detailing the various exploits of his empire, from steamboats to trains and more. These two still stand in Grand Central Terminal today, which was one of the most important stops for passengers on this rail line. The relocation occurred due to an issue that forced the freight depot to close in the early 1900s and reopen at a different location. And while we're on the topic, it should also be mentioned here that considering how much value passed through these freight depots, they were typically well protected by private guards, barriers, dogs, response teams, and even firearms. In other words, they protected the goods the same way that any of us might look after our own belongings, which in the modern day includes your personal information. Unfortunately, there are some services to really help out with that. I want to let you guys in on a little secret. When I first started this channel, I made my personal email address available, leading to an insane level of privacy invasion by scammers, spammers, and all the rest of it. But in a way, this was a great learning experience as it brought a new awareness of just how big my digital footprint really is. This is an issue most of us can probably relate to, and thanks to our sponsor, Delete Me, you now have the power to make yourself anonymous. Delete Me is a fantastic service that will basically erase you from the internet. I'm talking about hundreds of data broker websites selling your information, and it's an ongoing process. Once they clean house, they'll keep scanning for new data to show up so they can remove that also. So how does it work? Well, Delete Me searches all of the top data broker websites, and on average, they find and remove over 2,000 pieces of personal data for a customer in their first 2 years. To date, they removed over 100 million pieces of data for their customers. Thanks to Delete Me, I could remove old listings containing my vital records like former addresses, professional background, and even family photos. Now, thanks to Delete Me's ongoing monitoring, I feel confident that I can continue enjoying the privacy everyone deserves. I'd encourage you to do the same. So if you want to get your personal information removed from search results on the web, go to joindeleteme.com/Socash. Delete Me is offering 20% off their privacy plans to all my viewers. with my code Socash. Again, that's joindeleteme.com/Socash, promo code Socash. Now, we need to address the most critical issue. The railroad was built directly onto the streets of New York City. This might not sound that bad, but this was before cable cars or elevated railways, and the disastrous nature of the New York Central surface freight lines was how the city learned to make those later networks safe. Trains on the West Side Railroad were as long as several blocks, suffocating traffic on the busy streets of the rapidly growing metropolis. If that wasn't bad enough, there were frequent deaths as the trains plowed through anything in their path. The situation was so out of hand that the city hired men to ride on horseback ahead of the trains, blowing horns and waving flags to clear the way. They gained the nickname West Side Cowboys, alerting people to the danger of what we might call New York's Wild West. However, they could not keep the danger entirely contained. This rail line was so dangerous that it became known as Death Avenue, considering that by 1852 the trains had claimed the lives of anywhere from 200 to 436 people, most of whom were children. In fact, in 1892, the New York World newspaper went as far as to say that the trains were, quote, a monster which has menaced them, meaning the people of the city, night and day. And yes, it operated in this state well into the 1900s. Naturally, something had to be done about Death Avenue. The discourse surrounding a way forward began circulating in the early 1900s, and the city pressured the railroad company to act by refusing their license fee in 1908. However, since the railroad supplied the city with large amounts of their food, it could only work for a short period of time and was accepted the following year. It took another 20 years for the city, state, and railroad to agree on a course of action. They'd move the intercity railroad above street level. This undertaking, known as the West Side Improvement Project, was approved in 1929. The result was a 13-mile-long stretch of rail running through several blocks of Manhattan from 35th Street to Spring Street, eliminating 105 street railroad crossings. Its opening caused the aforementioned St. John's Freight Terminal to relocate to Spring Street, opening in 1936. The first train to run the High Line did so in 1933, bringing an end to Death Avenue. As New York City expanded in all respects at the end of the 1800s, so too did the New York Central Railroad. In 1885, they acquired a competitor railroad, the New York West Shore and the Buffalo Railway, and its last great addition came in 1906 with the acquisition of the so-called Big Four, the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railway. This railway was quite noteworthy on its own, having been created in 1889 when the New York Central Railroad merged its three preceding companies into one. Despite being involved with its creation, the railroad did not actually take control of it at that point, or even in 1906. Well, the New York Central Railway technically owned the Big Four. They were not officially integrated into the system until 1930, adding nearly 2,400 miles to the system and connecting the railroad with Indianapolis, St. Louis, Louisville, Cincinnati, Columbus, as well as another link to Chicago. The New York Central Railroad was almost unchallenged in its operating area, but it had one major rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Through its existence, the Pennsylvania Railroad controlled or owned at least part of 800 other rail lines and operated 11,640 miles of rail by 1926. Yet by the turn of the century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was more significant than the New York Central. Nevertheless, the New York Central was recognized as one of the elite railroads of the country, operating over 10,000 miles of rail and serving 9 U.S. states and even into Canada. At the beginning of the 1900s, the New York Central upgraded most of the lines in and around New York with electrification for safety and efficiency. This was extremely useful during the First World War, which saw it get bombarded by traffic as the nation threw in with the Allied powers of Europe. Part of the difficulties of this was the United States Railroad Administration, an experiment the United States took with nationalization. As a part of the administration, the New York Central was seized by the government for use during the war, with a guarantee of returning within 21 months of the peace treaty being signed, and that they would be in at least as good a condition as when they were acquired. This state of affairs hurt many railways, but the New York Central managed to enter the 1920s in a healthy state. Similarly, it survived the Great Depression without declaring bankruptcy, though it did fall on hard times. It renewed itself during the Second World War, well enough to purchase several hundred new train cars. But after the conflict ended, several issues had arisen that it could not shake. Among these issues were overregulation from the Interstate Commerce Commission and competition from rival railroads, including the Pennsylvania. However, the biggest issue had been growing for a while: the automobile. Anything that rails could transport, a truck or a car could transport with much more versatility, and sometimes even faster. This issue became even more apparent with the rise of airline freight, which became increasingly relevant in the 1950s, the same decade in which the New York Central Railroad neared bankruptcy. However, it was better off than its rival, the Pennsylvania, which began its decline in 1946. As the times increasingly changed, it became obvious to the two railroads that the status quo could not persist. They began discontinuing plans for a merger, despite several higher-ups, including the president of New York Central, protesting the concept of joining up with their arch-rivals. However, after a lot of searching elsewhere, it became apparent that this idea was the only option. Despite previously hassling the two railroads, the Interstate Commerce Commission approved the merger, which was made official on February 1st, 1968. The New York Central was no more, and the Pennsylvania Central Transportation Company was born. However, this was not to be either, as it was acquired by the Consolidated Rail Corporation in 1976 in an attempt to salvage the nearly bankrupt company. As it turns out, merging two destitute companies did not magically create a profitable corporation. Today, the rails that made up the New York Central Railroad have been split between CSX Transportation and the Norfolk Southern Railway. Some of its passenger lines were also integrated into Amtrak, which is a government-subsidized system. The High Line, the elevated rails that ran through New York City, had been abandoned since the 1980s. And as you may recall from a previous video, as of 2009, the High Line has reopened as a city park. One of the largest railroads in the American system, the New York Central, no longer exists as an entity. Its remnants became the groundwork for the rail companies of the present day, but they are not as important as they were in the past. However, the presence of those rail lines still facilitate the growth and development of New York City and beyond, shaping the northeastern United States into what it is. And we'll leave it there for today, but if you want to see how this story developed, make sure you catch our video about the Lost High Line by clicking right here. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching and subscribing. Until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.